In 1839, a 20-year-old queen and a 57-year-old emperor went to war. The weapon? Drugs. The prize? Tea. And the cost? Millions of lives and the collapse of an empire that had stood for 2,000 years. But before the war, before the deaths, before the collapse, one man tried to stop it. Dear Queen Victoria, why do you sell us poison that you ban in your own country? This letter, written by China's top official, never reached the Queen. 3 months later, they were at war. Picture London in the 1830s. Rain-soaked streets, crowded tenements, elegant drawing rooms, and in every single one of them, from the poorest worker to the wealthiest lord, everyone is obsessed with the same thing: Chinese tea. Not just enjoying it, obsessed with it. The average London household spent 5% of their entire yearly income on tea. 5%. That's like spending 2 weeks of your salary every year on a single drink. For a factory worker making £50 annually, that's over £2 just on tea. For the middle class, it was even more. Tea wasn't a luxury anymore. It had become a necessity, baked into British identity itself. The British drank tea at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They drank it during work breaks. They drank it when negotiating business deals. Tea houses lined every major street in London. The ritual of afternoon tea was becoming sacred. Britain had restructured its entire daily rhythm around a plant that only grew in China. Multiply that across the entire British Empire, and you've got yourself an economic crisis of massive proportions. Now, here's the problem. Britain desperately wanted everything China had. Tea, obviously. But also silk that made European fabric look like burlap. Porcelain, so fine that it made British pottery look like children's toys. Chinese lacquerware, jade carvings, furniture inlaid with mother of pearl. The British Empire, the most powerful industrial machine on earth, with factories pumping out goods day and night, looked at China and thought, we want all that, we need all of that. China looked back at Britain and thought, we need absolutely nothing from you. This wasn't arrogance. It was economic reality. The Qing dynasty controlled the world's largest economy. China produced everything it needed domestically. Rice from the south, wheat from the north, silk from Jiangsu, tea from Fujian. They had coal, iron, and a manufacturing base that dwarfed Europe's. China's GDP in 1820 was roughly 1/3 of the entire world's economic output. The British tried everything to crack this market. They sent samples of their finest wool textiles. Too heavy for China's climate, and besides, Chinese cotton and silk were superior. Your cutting-edge manufactured goods? Chinese craftsmanship perfected over millennia was still better. The Chinese had invented gunpowder, the compass, printing, and paper. They weren't exactly impressed by British industrial trinkets. The British East India Company kept trying. They offered clocks. The Chinese made their own. They offered glassware. China preferred porcelain. They offered scientific instruments. China had its own astronomical traditions. Every trade mission came back with the same report. The Chinese will only accept silver. So, China would only accept one form of payment: silver. Cold, hard, actual silver coins. Spanish silver dollars, to be precise, which had become the international currency of trade. And Britain was hemorrhaging it. Here's what the numbers looked like. In 1760, Britain was importing about 23 million pounds of tea annually from China. By 1800, it was 40 million pounds. By 1830, it was over 60 million pounds. Each pound of tea cost silver. The total bill was staggering. Some estimates put Britain's annual payment to China at over 3 million pounds sterling in the early 1800s. That's roughly equivalent to 400 million pounds in today's money. Every single year, the Bank of England was watching their silver reserves drain away like water through a sieve. Government officials were panicking. Merchants were furious. The entire British monetary system was built on maintaining gold and silver reserves to back the pound sterling. Lose too much silver, and the currency itself becomes unstable. British politicians held emergency sessions. Economists wrote frantic papers. The East India Company's directors stayed up at night calculating how long they could sustain these losses. Something had to change, or Britain would face a monetary crisis that could collapse the empire's finances. And somewhere in the British Empire's vast colonial holdings in India, someone had a thought. A terrible, brilliant, absolutely criminal thought. What if we didn't try to sell China what they wanted? What if we created something they couldn't resist? A 5-letter word: opium. Now here's how you rob an empire that doesn't want any of your products. Simple. You get them addicted to something new. You see, the British had conquered Bengal, India, in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey. Rich agricultural land, massive population, perfect climate. But more importantly, Bengal was ideal for growing opium poppies. The British East India Company realized they were sitting on a gold mine, or rather, a drug mine. They didn't invent the opium trade to China. Arab and Portuguese traders had been selling small amounts for centuries, mostly for medicinal use, but the British industrialized it. They turned it into a system. Here's how it worked. The East India Company, which was a British chartered joint stock company, forced Indian farmers to grow opium instead of food crops. The farmers had no choice. Grow opium or lose your land. The company bought the raw opium at fixed prices, processed it into concentrated balls of resin at factories in Patna and Benares, then auctioned it off to private merchants who handled the illegal part, the smuggling into China. This was genius from a legal standpoint. The British government could claim they weren't directly selling opium to China. They were just growing it in India and selling it at auction. What private merchants did with it afterward? Not their problem. It was the 19th century equivalent of a drug cartel using shell companies. The Chinese government had actually banned opium back in 1729, when this whole mess started. The Yongzheng emperor saw what opium was doing to people and outlawed it completely. Back then, the British were shipping about 200 chests of opium per year. Each chest weighed about 140 pounds. Do the math. That's roughly 28,000 pounds of opium annually, already illegal, already causing problems, but relatively small scale. Then the British really got to work. By 1790, they were shipping 4,000 chests annually. By 1820, it was 9,000 chests. By 1830, 18,000 chests. By 1838, over 40,000 chests per year. That's 5.6 million pounds of opium every single year. The trade had grown 200 times over in just over a century. This wasn't gradual drift. This was an exponential explosion. And here's the beautiful part. If you're a British merchant and have no soul, it was working perfectly. The mechanics were sophisticated. British ships loaded with opium would anchor off the Chinese coast at places like Linton Island, just outside Canton. They couldn't enter the harbor legally because opium was banned. So Chinese smugglers would row out in small boats, pay in silver, load up the opium, and row back. The smugglers then distributed it through networks that reached every province in China. These weren't small-time criminals. These were organized syndicates, with protection at every level. They bribed harbor masters, customs officials, local magistrates, provincial governors. The corruption was total. Some Chinese officials were addicts themselves, which made them easy to control. Others just wanted the money. A customs official might make 100 taels of silver a year in salary, but could make 10,000 taels by looking the other way on one opium shipment. The opium spread through China like a plague. It started in the coastal cities, Canton and Fujian, then moved inland along trade routes. Farmers smoked it after long days in the fields. Fishermen smoked it to cope with dangerous work. Soldiers smoked it to deal with boredom and poor conditions. Scholars smoked it in opium dens where they could relax and discuss philosophy. Government officials smoked it at banquets. Even members of the imperial family weren't immune. Princes, cousins of the emperor, were known opium users. The drug didn't discriminate. It destroyed lives across every social class. And the silver? Oh, the silver started flowing the other direction. For the first 100 years of this trade imbalance, silver flowed from Britain to China. Britain paid silver for tea, silk, and porcelain. China accumulated massive silver reserves. But as opium addiction spread, the flow reversed. By the 1820s, China was paying more silver for opium than Britain was paying for tea. The balance of trade had flipped completely. Chinese silver, accumulated over centuries, was now flooding out of the country to pay for British drugs. It was economic warfare disguised as commerce. By 1839, opium sales to China paid for the entire British tea trade and then some more. Britain was actually making a profit on the China trade for the first time in history. Problem solved. Empire saved, millions of Chinese addicts created. But hey, business is business, right? The opium trade was generating somewhere between 15 to 20% of the British Empire's annual income. Think about that. The empire upon which the sun never set, the most powerful political entity on Earth, was being financed by drug dealing. They'd turned the world's oldest continuous civilization into a customer base for illicit substances. And the best part? They convinced themselves it was China's fault for buying it. British merchants argued that they were simply meeting market demand. If the Chinese wanted to buy opium, who were the British to refuse? This was free trade. This was capitalism. If China didn't want opium in their country, they should enforce their own laws better. The circular logic was perfect. We're not responsible for Chinese addiction because we're just businessmen responding to demand. But we created the demand, but they're buying it voluntarily. But we're selling something you banned. But bans don't work if you don't enforce them. But you're bribing our officials. But that's a Chinese corruption problem. Around and around it went, with British merchants and politicians tying themselves in rhetorical knots to avoid the simple truth. They were drug dealers who'd found the ultimate captive market. The economic damage was becoming severe. Silver was flowing out of China at an alarming rate. Between 1820 and 1840, an estimated 100 million taels of silver left China to pay for opium. That's roughly 3,750 tons of silver. The entire Chinese monetary system was based on silver. Losing that much silver created inflation, made taxes harder to collect, and destabilized the economy. Farmers couldn't pay their taxes because silver was scarce and therefore expensive. A farmer who owed 10 taels in taxes in 1820 effectively owed 15 taels by 1835 because silver had become so valuable. This wasn't because taxes increased. It was because the currency itself had changed value due to silver outflow. The opium trade wasn't just creating addicts. It was breaking China's economy. And now the social fabric was tearing. Families were being destroyed. Men sold their land to buy opium. Women sold their jewelry. Children went hungry because fathers spent money on drugs. Crime increased as addicts stole to feed their habits. Productivity collapsed as workers chose opium dens over rice fields. Dao Guang was watching his empire collapse in slow motion, and he knew exactly who was responsible. So in late 1838, he made a decision. He appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with one mission: end the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was the right man for an impossible job. Born in 1785 in Fujian province, he'd passed the highest level of civil service examinations and worked his way up through the bureaucracy with an impeccable record. 54 years old by 1839, brilliant scholar, incorruptible official, known for actually enforcing laws when other officials just took bribes. He was a Confucian to his core, shaped by centuries of Chinese philosophical tradition. He genuinely believed that virtue and reason could solve any problem. He believed that if you explained something clearly enough, if you appealed to someone's better nature, if you showed them the moral path, they would take it. He'd studied the classics his entire life. He believed in moral persuasion, in the power of the law, in the basic goodness of human nature. He also had absolutely no idea what he was up against. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839 and immediately got to work. He wasn't subtle. He arrested 1,600 Chinese opium dealers in the first few weeks. He published lists of known addicts and demanded they report for treatment. He offered rehabilitation programs. He went after the corruption first, removing officials who were taking bribes. Then he turned to the foreign merchants. He sent them a letter demanding they surrender all opium stocks and sign bonds, promising never to deal opium again, on penalty of death. The merchants laughed. They'd been dealing opium for decades with no real consequences. Why would this be different? Lin didn't laugh back. He surrounded the foreign trade factories with troops. About 350 foreign merchants, including the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, were essentially under house arrest. No one could leave, no food was being brought in, no communication with their ships. Lin's message was clear: hand over the opium or starve. It took 6 weeks, but it worked. Charles Elliot, acting on behalf of the British merchants, agreed to surrender 20,283 chests of opium. That's 2.8 million pounds of the stuff, worth about 2 million pounds sterling. Lin had won a victory that seemed impossible. He had trenches dug near the shore, lined with rocks to prevent seepage. Workers broke open the opium chests and mixed the contents with water, lime, and salt, which neutralized the opium's potency. Then they flushed it all into the ocean during high tide. It took 23 days to destroy it all, from June 3rd to June 25th, 1839. Lin stood there and supervised personally, probably thinking he'd just saved China. Then he did something that shows you exactly what kind of man he was. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself. The letter was extraordinary. It wasn't angry or threatening. It was reasoned, almost gentle. He explained the harm opium was causing. He pointed out that Britain banned opium in its own country, so clearly the British understood it was harmful. He appealed to Victoria's sense of morality as a ruler responsible for her subjects' welfare. He wrote, "Your country lies 20,000 leagues away, but for all that, the way of heaven holds good for you as for us, and your instincts are not different from ours. For nowhere are there men so blind as not to distinguish between what brings life and what brings death." He was essentially saying, we're all human beings. You know right from wrong. You know opium destroys lives, so why are you selling it to us? Then he asked the question that echoes through history. Let us ask, where is your conscience? The letter was translated, sealed, and sent through official channels. It never reached Victoria. It was intercepted by British officials in Canton who took one look at it and thought, is this Chinese official seriously trying to lecture the British Empire about morality? But even if it had reached her, it wouldn't have mattered. Lin Zexu had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with reasonable people who would respond to ethical arguments. He thought destroying the opium would send a message. China is serious about ending this trade. He thought China's size, history, and moral authority mattered. He didn't understand that he'd just destroyed millions of pounds worth of British property. He didn't understand that Britain no longer cared about virtue or reason when profit was at stake. He didn't understand that the empire ran on capitalism, not Confucianism. And he definitely didn't understand that Britain was about to go to war over this. Back in London, Parliament had a decision to make. News of Lin Zexu's actions reached Britain in late 1839. China had destroyed British property worth £2 million. China had imprisoned British subjects. China was threatening to execute anyone caught selling opium. The question before Parliament was simple. Do we go to war over drug dealing? The debate in April 1840 was one of the most contentious in British parliamentary history. The opposition, led by William Gladstone, was savage in their criticism. Gladstone was only 30 years old, but already a rising political star. He stood up in Parliament and said exactly what many were thinking but were not bold enough to say. He called it a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. He pointed out that they were literally going to war to force another country to accept drug addiction. He asked whether British honor meant protecting drug dealers. He noted that opium was illegal in Britain itself, so how could they justify forcing it on China? Other MPs joined in. They pointed out the hypocrisy. They questioned whether commercial interests should drive foreign policy. They argued that Britain would be seen as a nation of drug pushers. The moral case against war was clear. But Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, wasn't interested in morality. He was interested in power. And he reframed the entire debate brilliantly. This wasn't about opium, he argued. This was about free trade. This was about China refusing to engage in normal commercial relations. This was about protecting British subjects who had been illegally detained. This was about whether any nation could simply destroy British property and face no consequences. This was about teaching China to respect international law. He never said drug dealing. He said commerce. He never said addiction. He said trade rights. He never said millions of Chinese lives. He said British interests and national honor. The vote was incredibly close. 271 MPs voted against the war. 262 voted for it. Britain came within 9 votes of not starting the Opium War. 9 votes. If just 5 MPs had switched sides, history changes completely. But they didn't. Britain went to war in 1840, and they sent a force that would make the outcome inevitable. The expeditionary force consisted of 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 28 transports, and about 4,000 troops. Doesn't sound like much, but this was cutting-edge military technology. The warships had long-range cannons that could bombard coastal fortifications from positions Chinese guns couldn't reach. The steamers didn't need wind. They could maneuver freely and tow sailing ships into position. The troops had rifles with greater range and accuracy than Chinese muskets. The Chinese military, by contrast, was still using technology that hadn't changed much in 200 years. Wooden war junks, smoothbore cannons with limited range, matchlock muskets, bows and arrows, swords. They had numbers. The Qing military nominally had 800,000 troops, but numbers don't matter when the technology gap is this wide. The war itself was barely a war. It was a massacre dressed up as military action. The British began by blockading the Pearl River, cutting off trade to Canton. Then they moved north, attacking coastal cities systematically. They took Dinghai in July 1840. They occupied the Yangtze River Delta. They threatened to cut off the Grand Canal, which supplied Beijing with food from the south. Chinese forces fought bravely. At some battles, they fought to the last man. But bravery doesn't stop cannon shells. At Ningbo, British warships bombarded the city from positions where Chinese guns couldn't reach them. Chinese soldiers had to watch their fortifications get destroyed without being able to fight back. The British would land troops who would advance with rifles, picking off Chinese soldiers from 300 yards away, well beyond the range of Chinese muskets. Chinese commanders would order charges, and their troops would run into walls of rifle fire. The casualty ratios were obscene. At some engagements, the British lost a handful of men while Chinese casualties numbered in the hundreds. Emperor Daoguang was getting reports of British victories and couldn't understand what was happening. His generals kept losing. His fortifications kept falling. These foreign barbarians, who were supposed to respect Chinese power and civilization, were destroying his empire. He based his entire understanding of the world on the idea that China was the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, the most powerful nation on earth. For 2,000 years, that had been true. China had been invaded before by the Mongols, by the Manchus, but always the invaders had adopted Chinese culture and governed through Chinese systems. China had always absorbed its conquerors, but the British weren't interested in being absorbed. They weren't interested in Chinese culture or philosophy. They wanted trade concessions and opium profits, and they had the military power to take them. Daoguang tried negotiating. He tried offering limited concessions. He tried changing commanders. Nothing worked. The British kept winning. By August 1842, British warships had fought their way up the Yangtze River and were anchored outside Nanjing, the old imperial capital. If the British took Nanjing, they could march to Beijing. The capital would be defenseless. The dynasty itself would be at risk. The war was over. China had no choice but to surrender. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed on August 29, 1842, aboard the HMS Cornwallis. The terms were designed to humiliate. China had to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, 6 million for the destroyed opium, 3 million for debts owed to British merchants, 12 million for war costs. That's equivalent to roughly half of China's annual government revenue. China had to open 5 ports to British trade: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. These weren't just trading posts. These were cities where British subjects could live, trade, and operate under British law, not Chinese law. The treaty established the principle of extraterritoriality, which meant British citizens in China couldn't be tried in Chinese courts. China had to hand over Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. Forever. A piece of Chinese territory under permanent British control. The British also got most favored nation status, meaning any concessions China granted to other foreign powers automatically applied to Britain too. And the opium trade? The treaty didn't mention it, which meant it would continue. Britain had gone to war to force China to accept British drug dealing, and they'd won. Within a few years, opium imports actually increased. By the 1850s, China was importing over 70,000 chests annually. Let's talk about what happened to everyone involved, because nobody really won this war. Some people just lost less than others. Queen Victoria went on to reign for 63 more years, until 1901. She became the symbol of the British Empire at its height, the empress who presided over a quarter of the world's population. She probably never knew the details of how the opium trade worked. Her ministers presented it as a matter of trade rights and national honor. Whether she would have cared if she knew the truth is an open question. Her empire was now financed partly by drug money, and that's just how things were. Lord Palmerston became Prime Minister twice, serving from 1855 to 1858 and 1859 to 1865. He was celebrated as a defender of British interests, a man who understood that power mattered more than sentiment. He never expressed a moment of regret about the Opium War. Why would he? From his perspective, he defended British commerce against an unreasonable foreign power and won. That it was drug commerce was just an inconvenient detail that good PR could handle. The British merchants, particularly William Jardine and James Matheson, became fabulously wealthy. Jardine had died in 1843, just after the war ended, but his legacy lived on. Matheson used his opium fortune to buy a massive estate in Scotland. He became a member of Parliament. He was respected in society. Nobody mentioned where the money came from. Their company, Jardine Matheson, successfully lobbied Parliament to start the war and reap the profits afterward. The firm diversified over time into legitimate businesses: trading, shipping, insurance, banking. Today, it's one of Asia's largest conglomerates with interests in property, retail, and more. Yes, a company built on drug money not only survived but thrived for 180 years. That's capitalism, baby. Emperor Daoguang never recovered from the defeat. He lived through the humiliation of signing the Treaty of Nanjing and died in 1850, just as the Taiping Rebellion was beginning. That rebellion, led by a man who claimed to be Jesus Christ's younger brother and was partly fueled by the chaos and weakness the Opium War had exposed, would kill more than 20 million Chinese people over 14 years. Daoguang lived long enough to see his empire broken, but not long enough to see how much worse it would get. Lin Zexu, the man who tried to stop it all, was blamed for everything. In the imperial court's view, he had provoked the British unnecessarily. He had failed to defeat them. He had brought disaster upon China. He was stripped of all his titles and exiled to Yili, a remote province on the western edge of the empire, as far from the capital as you could be sent without leaving China entirely. He spent years in disgrace, working on irrigation projects in the frontier, watching from afar as his country suffered through the consequences of the war he'd tried to prevent. Later generations would recognize him as a hero, a man who tried to save China when everyone else was selling out or giving up. But in 1842, he was a scapegoat for an emperor who didn't understand what had happened to his world. And China? China entered what historians now call the Century of Humiliation. The Opium War was just the beginning. There'd be a second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, when Britain and France teamed up to force even more concessions. They burned the old summer palace in Beijing, one of the greatest architectural treasures in Chinese history, just to make a point. More unequal treaties followed. The Americans got trade concessions in 1844, the French in 1844, the Russians in 1851. Every foreign power wanted a piece of China. More ports opened, more territory ceded, more extraterritorial rights granted. China became a semi-colonial state, carved up by foreign powers who didn't even respect it enough to colonize it properly. The opium trade continued and expanded. By the 1850s, over 70,000 chests were coming in annually. It wasn't until 1906 that China finally started to get control over the trade, and even then it took until the 1940s to truly eliminate mass opium addiction. That's 100 years of social devastation. The Qing dynasty limped along, weakened and humiliated, until 1912 when it finally collapsed completely. The Republic of China that followed was chaotic and unstable. Then came Japanese invasion, then Civil War, then the Communist Revolution in 1949. The entire trajectory of modern Chinese history was shaped by this moment when foreign powers decided that profit mattered more than people. And yes, remember that letter Lin Zexu wrote to Queen Victoria, the one asking where her conscience was? It never reached her. It was lost in transit, intercepted somewhere between Canton and London. But the words didn't disappear. Lin had copies made and distributed. The letter was eventually published in British newspapers, where the public could read his plea for themselves. The text survives in historical archives, translated into dozens of languages. Lin Zexu wrote thousands of characters in elegant calligraphy, laying out his argument piece by piece. He explained the harm. He appealed to shared humanity. He asked reasonable questions. He believed that if he could just communicate clearly enough, surely the British would see reason. Let us ask, where is your conscience? Victoria never answered, because she never received the question. But history did answer. And the answer wasn't pretty. The answer was, conscience doesn't matter when there's money to be made. Morality doesn't matter when there's an empire to run. Justice doesn't matter when you have the bigger guns. International law is whatever the powerful say it is. And the weak, no matter how ancient their civilization or sophisticated their culture, will be forced to accept terms dictated by those with superior military technology. China spent the next 100 years dealing with the consequences of that answer. The Communist Revolution, Mao's campaigns, the Cultural Revolution, the entire trajectory of modern Chinese foreign policy, all of it was shaped by this moment. If you want to understand why China is so protective of its sovereignty today, why they're so suspicious of foreign intervention, why they're so absolutely determined to never be weak again, you have to go back to 1839. Go back to a young queen who probably never knew the details and an old emperor who understood too late. Go back to merchants who chose profit over humanity and politicians who chose power over principle. Go back to a letter that never arrived and a war that never should have happened. Think about how a trade imbalance over tea led to one of history's most unjust wars. Think about how the most powerful empire on earth went to war to force another country to accept drug addiction. Think about how easily economic interests can override moral concerns when the people making decisions are far from the consequences. And think about Lin Zexu, 54 years old, writing by candlelight in Canton, genuinely believing that if he could just explain the situation clearly enough, surely reasonable people would do the right thing. He believed in dialogue, in reason, in the power of moral argument. He thought the world operated on principles that transcended national interest. He was wrong. But maybe he wasn't naive. Maybe he was just hopeful. Maybe he understood that the world doesn't work on moral principles, but thought it should, and was willing to try anyway. Maybe that makes him not naive, but brave. The British didn't see reason. They saw profit margins and trade deficits and national prestige. They saw a chance to solve their economic problems and expand their empire. They saw weakness they could exploit. The silver drained from Britain to China for 100 years, then from China back to Britain over the next century. Empires rose and fell. Millions died. Fortunes were made. Companies thrived. Treaties were signed. History marched on. And somewhere in the British Library, there's a letter that was never read, asking a question that was never answered but echoes still. Where is your conscience? It's a question every generation has to answer for itself. Because the same dynamics, profit versus people, power versus principle, short-term gain versus long-term harm, they're still with us. Different products, different empires, different technologies, but the same fundamental choice. Lin Zexu thought he was fighting drug dealers. He was actually fighting something much larger and much harder to defeat, the logic of empire itself, which says that might makes right and economic interests trump ethical concerns. He lost that fight. China lost that war. But the question remains, hanging in the air like smoke from an opium pipe, waiting for each of us to answer. Where is your conscience? Good question. I'm Malcolm, and this is where history meets economics. Subscribe now, because the questions we refuse to answer don't disappear, they just get more expensive. Lin Zexu asked, "Where is your conscience?" in 1839. China is still waiting for an answer. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.